Hi guys, this is Mike Hibbert back with another Python Django tutorial for you. This time round we're going to have a basic introduction on how to do unit testing with the Django framework. Now, whether you've done unit testing in other languages or whether unit testing is a new idea to you, it's a very important thing that your code can be trusted and be reliable. And the only way that you can really establish that is by running a set of tests, and Django has a built-in framework that allows us to do that. As well as that, there's another tool that we're going to use that helps us to basically establish which parts of our code have been tested and which have not. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install a command line tool that's going to help us to do that. And the command line tool is called Coverage. Now, to install it, as you can see here, all you have to do is use the Python installer and basically type in pip space install space coverage. And if you do that, that should happen relatively quickly. It's not a big package, so it shouldn't take ages to download. As you can see, mine's already installed. Now, what does Coverage do? Coverage goes through the tests inside of your Django application, and it looks to see what's been examined and what's been tested throughout the tests and in relation to your models and your views and various different bits of code that you write. So right out of the box, we haven't written any tests so far. And in fact, I've deliberately ignored the testing situation because of not wanting to overcomplicate some of the previous tutorials. But now I think it's probably about time that we actually started to look into doing some testing of some of the stuff. Now, I'm not going to cover the testing of everything in the things that we've written so far. I'm just going to give you a basic introduction and show you, a rough idea of how to get started and where to get information about what needs to be tested. And obviously Coverage is going to play a large part in that to help us to do that. So how do we actually run a test? Well, the tests that we have are contained inside of our article app folder, and this is for our specific app that we're testing. You can have tests inside of this file also, this folder also, for the main test of the website, but the one I'm going to focus on is just testing our app that we've been building, the articles app. So we've got a test.py file that's already installed there. It was created when we created the app itself using the Django admin and the manage functions. So that gets put in there for free. You don't have to remember to put that in there. It should already be in there when you create an app. And what we do to trigger the Django framework to actually use that tests.py file is we run from the command line python manage.py test, and then you can leave it at that and test the whole site, or you can basically say specifically I want to test one specific app in the site. So in our case, we could run python manage py test article, and that would run the test suite inside of the tests.py file for that particular app. And this is probably what you would get, something like that. So we get a few bit of output messages, and then it says creating test database for alias default. This basically means that it's creating an alternative database for our tests when it comes to doing models and things like that. So we've got in our article, in our Django project, yeah, that's the word I'm looking for, project, we've already created a storage.db, and you'll remember that from the database tutorial. What it'll do is it'll create a duplicate of one of those and use that database to do all the tests. So we should effectively, in the creation of the test, create an empty form of this database containing all the schema and everything that's involved in the actual site itself, but then use it to create empty records for our testing purposes. So that leaves this particular database completely alone to itself and unaltered, which is handy because you don't want to mess around with your real data. So we ran the test, it created the database, then it says ran 0 tests in no seconds, and then OK, and then it destroys the database in the final process. So that's okay, but what if we want a bit more detail? We need to add an extra command line option to this, and the way that we do that is we add -v for verbosity and level 2 for the level of verbosity. So if you run level 1, for instance, you get exactly what you've got for the first run round, which is the default, but for 2 we then get to see a bit more about what kind of things are going on under the hood. So for the purposes of testing, we're going to leave this at verbosity level number 2 so that we can see which tests have actually been put through the system successfully and which ones have failed. So that's enough of the command line side of things. How do we actually make a test? Well, the first thing we do is we open our tests.py file, and we need to do a few imports of some of the modules that are contained inside the framework. So the first thing we do is we install from Django.test a test case class, and this is what we're going to use to build a set or a suite of tests for our system, and I'll show you later on exactly how we use that. Next, we're going to import our models. So from article.models, we're going to bring in article. We're also going to bring in this get upload file name because, as you remember, in our models file we created our article, but we also use this function in the process of using that model. So when we run our coverage program, it will examine this model and notice that it's using this extra function and insist that we also cover that in the tests. So we need to import that also because we're going to build a test for that as well. The next part is just to basically create a class, and I'm going to call it article test, and it's deriving from the test case class, and that means that it will have various different features that are involved in the test case. So it will have a method called setup, and then it'll have a method to tear down or to destroy any data that was created during the tests. It will also have something included in it which I think is pretty awesome, is that it has the ability to actually load a web page from within the test class and return it as if it was actually from your web server. So built into the test system, you not only have the ability to test code, you have the ability to test things like HTML, which you would generate with your views. And I'm going to show you later on how exactly we go ahead and do a test on a view. But first of all, let's just do the basics, and let's do a basic test for our article model. Now, to bring in to do the article model, we need to be able to create a new article. So I need the time zone import, like we did in the previous way back when we first started and we did our database. We need the time zone so that we can get the current time from the server, so that you can create a basic article object. So I'm going to make a helper function which just basically says create article, with a couple of defaults in here. So it just says the title should be default test article and body should be default blah blah blah, and then I'm just going to get it to create a brand new article. Now, you might have seen me just basically create an instance of article in previous tutorials. This is another way of doing exactly the same as that. It's the more ORM kind of way of doing things. So this uses the object relational mapping framework underneath, but it does the same thing as if you had created an instance of article. So you basically go for the objects and call the create method. We pass in our title and body, the time zone now, so our default time stamp, and set the legs to 0. So that's our helper function to create a bog standard article, and that'll make things simpler for when we're actually starting to test or run the other tests on the actual model itself, and later when we actually do a test on the views. So what's next? This is our first test, and what it does is it basically tests that we can actually create an article. Now notice it starts with the word test underscore. All of our functions will be called that way, so make sure that you remember that convention. A test must have its function name called test underscore and then whatever you want to name it afterwards. So in this case we're going to create a bog standard article using our helper function, and then we're going to use one of the built-in functions that comes along with the test case class. This is the assert true method. Now there are other assert methods in there. There's an assert equal, there's also a function called assert in which tests to see whether a string can be found inside of another string. There's various other asserts that you can apply, and it's worth you going and doing a bit of Googling to find out if there's any special other cases that you want to test for. But in the case of this, we're going to assert that it's true that this variable a is an instance of article, and that's enough to test to say, have we created an article? Can you create an article using the article model? The answer hopefully is going to be yes in our test framework. The second bit is we've got in our model a function that basically has been overridden, so we want to test to make sure that this is actually working. So to test that, we put assert equal, so assert that the output of a dot underscore underscore Unicode is the same as the title, or the value that's contained in the title field of this particular instance. And if that's the same, then we're pretty sure that this Unicode function is returning the correct value, because there we are, it's returning self-title. Seems a bit mental, I suppose, that you should test whether something that's already been passed back by this function actually is the same as that, but you never know. In the future somebody might change the way that this function works, and if they do, it may not be returning what's basically inside of there. It might be doing some special process, and that's really what the unit test does. Is it establishes what the behavior of that particular function should be, and then if it changes in the future and breaks and it doesn't return what we expect it to do, this unit test will then at that point in time point that out to us, and we'll be able to fix it. And that's really one of the beauties of doing unit testing, is it gives you that assurance that if you do change something in the future that you may not remember about, it will warn you and it will tell you exactly where to go and what's gone wrong. So what's next? Right, now we need to do a little test for our function up here. So we've got get upload file name that we use inside the model. And what does upload file name do? It just builds a string, and it uses the time function to create a timestamp that gets bunged into the name of the file along with the actual file name, and we do a quick replacement of any periods in there with an underscore so that we don't get any file system problems. So how do we test that? Well, let's bring in our import time and then create a new test. test get upload file name. And the file name we're going to use is just cheese.txt. Wasn't feeling particularly creative today, so cheese is the word. And we're going to basically say, right, the path should be this, which is more or less a cut and paste of what we put in this. But for the sake of making sure that in the future, if we do change the functionality of the actual code that's inside the function, and it's not the same as what the answer we've defined here should be, it will kick off about it and tell us that there's a problem. So now we actually do the created path using the function this time. We use self for its first argument, because if you notice in our function declaration it uses instance as its first argument. In the case of it actually being used in the real model, the instance would probably be an instance of article, but it doesn't really matter too much because that's not really the important thing. The important thing is what the file name is going to be. So we can get away with just bunging self in there. We could put anything in there really, but stick null in if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter because that's not actually getting used in the actual functionality of the code. This file name variable is. So we generate a path using what we think it should be, and then we generate a path using what the function thinks it should be, and then we do a test and we assert that they are equal. If they're not equal, this test will fail. Okay, so I'll just step back, and if we save that, we can now go back to our tests in the command line. We can run the Python manage, and we see here that now we have 2 more tests that are being indicated as having been okay. So we've got test article creation, which has worked, test get upload file name, that's worked also, and it said run 2 tests with how long it took. So far we've got 2 tests that prove our code's working, and that we're going to be confident that if there's any future changes in the code base, that it'll highlight anything that breaks. So how does the code coverage come into all of this? Well, we're going to slightly redo our command here, and instead of starting with Python, we're going to start with coverage, and we'll say we're going to say to coverage run Python or manage.py rather, with the parameters test article at verbosity level 2. If we ask it to do that, it runs almost exactly the same as the other command. However, if we now do coverage HTML, coverage will generate us a report in HTML. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, because coverage will actually make your life a bit easier and start pointing out places where you could potentially do better testing. So it's just done that, and if we go and look in our Django folder, we should now see HTML cov, and inside there, if you scroll right to the bottom, or if you do in my window anyway, you see the index.html, and if I open that up in my Chrome browser, you get a big list with coverage report of 37%. So 37% of the stuff inside of this report has been covered effectively for testing. But notice that some of these things aren't necessarily stuff that we're interested in, because obviously we are not the people who write Django framework. So that's not really relevant to us. What is relevant to us is if we go right down to the bottom, we see our particular models. So if we look there, we've got 17% covered. However, if I go back to my code and I just get rid of that last test that we just did and save, do a quick rerun, regenerate the HTML, it should be a slightly different report. And there you can see there's one column that we've missed, or one test that we've missed. What is the test that it thinks? Well, here it is. It's highlighted in red, and it's saying basically there should be a test here, but it's missing. So if you've got code that you're not necessarily sure what to test, Coverage will point out what it is that needs to be tested, or more or less suggest what you think you should be tested. I'm not saying that you should test every single line that Coverage points out, because to be fair, sometimes you can get away with just ignoring certain things because you're confident that they're steady enough. But in the main, you should look to Coverage to try and give you a good idea of where to start at least. So when you start a brand new project, and you've written a few lines of code, even if you just created a model, then this is a good starting place to give you an idea of what to include tests for. I know testing starts out, it's pretty hard, so the idea of getting your head around testing to start with isn't that easy, but this gives you a great suggestion to get you kicked off and to start. So I'll just put my function back. Okay, then run my coverage command again, then coverage HTML, and that should then return it back to what it was. So yeah, that's not highlighted anymore because obviously we have covered it in our tests. Right, so that's some basic tests done. What else can we test? Well, in this case, we're going to start and do some testing for the views. And to do that, we need to start employing something that we haven't used in any of the tutorials so far. It's the function called reverse. Now, as you can see, it's contained in the Django core libraries under URL resolvers. So what does that mean? It means that this function can resolve a view mapping through to what it should be in terms of a browser URL. So for instance, in our URLs declarations, we have things like article.views.articles and article.views.article, which are views that we've written in Python. Now reverse knows how to turn that particular reference into a URL that would match the pattern that you've created in here. So how can we test that sort of thing? How can we test URLs and actually start and test views? Well, what we need to do is we need to set up a little bit extra to do with our article model. We need to add in a new method that basically allows this framework, the testing framework, to go into our articles model and establish what an acceptable URL might be. So to do that, we add a method called getAbsoluteURL, and it just returns a string, but it returns a string that tells us, or tells the system, what we consider a proper URL to an article would be. And in this case, it's the path articles get and then the ID on the end. Okay, now I'm just going to get rid of that because I want to show you something interesting which shows what kind of output you get from both the command line and from the HTML tests. So I'm going to do this test inside here, test article list view, and the list view is basically the page where we have all of the articles listed one by one that was seen throughout the tutorial. So in there we've got a list of articles, and we want to be able to test whether the article that we've created in the database actually turns up on that page. So to do that, we create an article first of all, and then we use reverse to reference the actual view in the view's name in the code inside the Python modules, and return what the real URL for that would be, as if we had actually visited it through the web browser. So we used this part to translate into what this part would turn into. So then we use that along with the built-in client that I was talking about earlier. So the test case class has a built-in web client that can go and visit URLs as if it is a browser and return what the response from that URL would be. So this is where it gets really great, because testing code isn't necessarily easy, but testing actual output from browsers and from the Django framework in terms of rendered HTML, that's even harder. So this little guy here makes it 10 times easier. So we use that to get the URL and return whatever's inside of there. We can then test to see what the status code was. So what was the server's response, and we want to know if it was server response 200, which means our request was fine. That's one test that we can stick in there just to make sure that the whole thing actually worked in the first place. Then we can go assert in. Now assert in takes this string here, or whatever value you put in there, and then says, is it inside of the response's content? So the massive big clump of HTML that came back from our request through the client went into the content variable, and we're going to test whether that title ends up in there. And if it is in there, then we're pretty sure that this article's actually been displayed in there. So that's how we test whether a view's actually working or not. So the next thing that we need to do is we're going to test the individual article, and this is where it gets interesting with regards to what we did earlier here. So remember I chopped off the extra ending forward slash, and that's deliberately going to cause an error that I want you to see, so that you can see what you can expect in terms of reports when it comes to testing. So again, we create another article. This time we use reverse to go to the article's views article URL, which is this one here, and it should then generate an articles /get /article ID. Using this, reverse just basically goes backwards, hence it's called reverse, goes backwards into the system and works out what that should be in terms of a browser URL. We pass it an argument of the ID so that it knows which article we want to look at, and then again we just get the response using our client, and then whatever comes back in the response we're going to then test with this following thing. We're going to say assert it's equal, or the URL for this particular article, using our new method here, get absolute URL, is equal to what reverse generates, using that statement there. And if they're equal, then we know that get absolute URL is working, and we also know that our reverse URLs system is actually working too. Next, we test again, is the response code 200, and then again we need to test whether the title turned up in the content that was returned, and that should be enough to do the tests. Now with all of this, I don't expect this test to fail, but I do expect this test to fail, and I really hope it does, because then I could show you something really cool. So the coverage for the tests is done, so let's just run that coverage command again. Here we go. Test article creation worked, was okay. This one failed, so what was it? Test article detail view failed. Why did it fail? Okay, so here's why it failed. The assertion error said that articles get 1 / is not equal to articles get 1 without a /. Why is that important? Well, because Python really wants you to put / on the end of your URLs. It can be important in various different situations where you're trying to generate links to different pieces of content, and you have to follow the conventions that Django wants you to. So if you haven't got that / on there, it might break in some situations. So if we put our / back on, run our tests again, all 4 of those came through okay. If we run our HTML coverage, or our coverage HTML command, notice it's taking a little bit longer this time, and the reason why that is because now it's discovered that we have more than just models inside of our framework that need testing, and in fact I'm expecting to see a much longer list of things that coverage can now detect in terms of what we should now test. So if we go back down the bottom of the list, because it's obviously gotten a lot longer, we can now see that apart from our models, we have forms, we have our API, which we covered in our TastyPie tutorial, we have the admin, we have the URLs, we have tests, we have views. So you can see there, if we move along the line to the tests, that this has only got 37% coverage. Not ideal. And you can see that our models have 100% coverage, so we've done well with the models. However, our views are not necessarily covered. Now, why would that be? If we look inside of our views, it's highlighted quite a bit of the code, because we've got more than just our first 2 articles in there. So we can establish that our main article detail page, where it shows one single article, that's been thoroughly tested, because it's not in the least bit covered in red. However, our list page has a bit more involved, and there are a couple of things that we could add tests for here. So there's tests for cookies and tests for session. And the way that you would do that is obviously to start and set up things in terms of passing values across before we do our call to the client. So before we do our client call in tests, before this line occurs, we do a little bit of setup to say include this in the session, include it in the cookies. If you're going to post values across, then you need to set up something in the post arrays to do that. But all of these things here can be covered by that. So there's a test needed for whether the request post contains anything when we create an article using one of our forms. What we've also got in here is also forms, but you can see there that that doesn't necessarily need any testing, because it doesn't really do anything unusual that hasn't already been tested by the Django framework anyway. So there you see that you've got a slightly better chance at working out what you should and shouldn't test. I know that in some situations in the past when I've been developing software, when you first start doing tests, you kind of sit there with blankly and go, I've no idea where to start. Well, this is a really great tool that basically lets you have half an idea of where you should start. And the basic idea is that if you see that this is not 100%, that's probably where you should start. So that's been a basic introductory tutorial to help you to get the idea of how to actually do testing. There is a little bit more to it, and if I get enough requests, I may do an extended or more advanced version, just to give you an idea. There are ways of testing things like, did your templates load properly? Have you got the correct one in there? There's lots of things that you can test, and the more tests you have in there, the more confidence you can have in your code and in the reliability of the applications that you can build. Okay, well, that's the end of the tutorial. Thanks for watching. I hope this was informative and educational for you. If you liked the video, then please click the like button. And if you'd like to know more about any of the tutorials in the future that I'm going to be doing, please click the subscribe button, and I'll give you an update as soon as they are published. I usually publish on a Friday. Once I've gotten everything that usually happens to me out in a week out of the way. So hopefully I'll be able to spend some more time and send another tutorial out next Friday. But in the meantime, thanks for watching.